Hey everyone, it's Neon Polygons, and today I want to talk about why G4TV's content just isn't working from the viewpoint of a former G4TV staffer, which is myself. So, quick background story of me. I actually started my career at G4TV at this point, I think like 17 years ago. And, at the time, I think a lot of the differences between obviously now and, or back then and now is that, G4 TV was kind of like a really cool thing. It stood out because it was about, video games, right? And I know a lot of people that you'll hear on YouTube and podcasts, they've all been talking about, well, of course G4 TV, is not going to work because now it's not that special, right? In an age of YouTube and Twitch, video games are, I wouldn't say mainstream entirely, but they're pretty, it's much more okay, so to speak, to talk about video games than it was in the early 2000s, where video games were still seen as kind of like a geek slash niche area. And in some ways it still is, but back then, video games had not reached that, appeal of big money, right? It didn't have that Hollywood feel to them yet. Back then, video games were still, in a way, just seen as more expensive toys for boys, right? And any way you slice it, you know, and, you know, G4 TV was very much so a risky venture. And so you kind of compare it to now where G4 TV coming out, even with its branding and its brand name, it wasn't really that special, right? It's like, okay, great, it's another video game kind of media brand that's about to be put out there that would have to compete with the likes of, say, something like, I don't know, Nintendo Life or IGN or GameSpot or whatever online. And to be frank, G4 TV never really had much clout in the video game industry to begin with. So, anyways, look, I kind of want to just bring that up as like a little bit of the background as to like how G4 kind of came about and in the circumstances in which it came about versus to how it kind of came out in, today's world of 2022. Now, when I was at G4 TV, again, like I bring up that background, right? To kind of explain like where I'm going with this. And you'll hear a lot of people who are kind of talking about G4 TV and why just they don't feel it's interesting because again in the world of YouTube and Twitch, it's very commonplace, okay? And in a way, there's nothing kind of bold or risky as to like what G4 TV, revival was coming into. Back again when I was at G4 TV, and this is as I mentioned, G4's arrival was at the end of the day, it was a risk. It was a super risk. Okay, it was a channel purely based upon video games, which honestly, even back then, was fairly difficult to talk about. There's not a lot of content that you can kind of bring up. Again, at that point in time in the video game industry, you're really only talking maybe like 30 years of history of video games by that standpoint. As around 2004 2005, most I guess people who had played video games like at that point there had only been a few generation of consoles, and the arcade scene was pretty much already dead by that standpoint, or by that time point. And so it was very difficult to create content, like very difficult to create content about video games back then. And I remember being at G4 TV and how much we struggled just to say like, man, what are we going to talk about? There were a lot of meetings where again, it's one thing to about reading about video games in magazines. It's one thing to basically put it on air, where a lot of content will basically disappear in like 2 minutes, or all your writing that you could do about video games would literally only be like 2 minutes of airtime. And I never really thought about it until like the G4 TV revival, where man, we did a lot with very little back then. Okay, I think about when I was at G4TV. Again, I'll come up with a lot of like these writers meetings that we had, and a lot of times it was kind of like, okay, so we got this footage of like the new GameCube Zelda game. How are we going to present it, right? Or hey, by the way, there's one clip I remember. Hey, there's this new and one basketball video game. Okay, so we got to make like a segment around it somehow. Okay, let's send Adam Sessler to go play basketball at an and one basketball festival, right? It was like really pulling teeth. Okay, and you can probably tell if you watched a lot of early G4 TV, a lot of the shows were kind of like boring actually. Again, you had your early X Play and at the time screensavers, but the majority of the shows were just kind of like video game footage, right? It was like I remember we had some show that just showed, cutscenes from video games, and that honestly was boring as heck. Um, we had another show that it was like kind of video game competition, but again at that time watching people play video games was really boring. Okay, we had some great documentary series at the time. I'm trying to remember like some of the names of them, but it was like documentary series that we would show like it'd be the history of SNK, the story of the Dreamcast going under, story of the start of video games. And a lot of those documentaries that we showed, they were about like maybe 30 minutes each, but they, there wasn't actually, surprisingly, by that point in 2004, the history of video games was still fairly new. So there wasn't really that much for us to talk about. So, you know, I didn't realize this at the moment, obviously when I was working there, but in hindsight, it's very impressive knowing that, hey man, we came up with a whole linear TV channel just about video games. How the hell did we do that, right? When there was like not much of history and not much, let's I'll put it bluntly, there wasn't much content really for us to show. So we had to create content around kind of video games. And so here's really where I'm getting into the narrative why the content of the new G4 TV revival just isn't working, especially when compared to what people remember from the original G4 TV. Now, first and foremost is, again, G4 is this current G4 TV revival. It's now out where video games a little bit are, or talking about video games and video game content is a lot more commonplace on YouTube. But that's not the reason why it's not working. It's not the reason why like a lot of this content that people, in my opinion, aren't really watching. If you watch G4 TV back in its heyday, and I would probably say like at the height, it was probably like around 2004, 2005, 2006 ish, right? And again, keep everything that I just said in mind. Not a lot of video game content that you could really create at that time. The industry was still, only 30 years. It wasn't exactly like, Hollywood studios. There was like kind of like a legacy that was kind of developed yet. And again, video games back then were still kind of like a niche thing. It was still kind of like geek fandom, right? So a lot of people that were hired to create the content for G4 TV, none of us were really, like I would say, gamers. Like we weren't gamers by profession. By profession, what we were TV and, production, professionals, right? A lot of the people that you met at G4 TV, none of them came from like writing for, anything about video games whatsoever. Like zero people that I worked with at G4 TV, aside from the editorial team, right, who are the people in charge of like working with the video game companies. Everyone who worked on a TV show such as X Play and even Attack of the Show or the Screensavers, its predecessor, everyone was basically a true TV comedy writer or producer, and they just happened to love video games, okay? But people were hired based upon quality number one. They were hired because they had experience in writing for TV and film. They had experience for producing in TV and film. They had experience in being, um, as you can say, best say, being on-air personalities, primarily first for being a TV personality that just happened to like video games. No one back then, by professional trade in the TV and film industry, was, hey, I'm a video game professional or expert. No, everyone was essentially first and foremost. And this is what no one is going to say elsewhere on YouTube because no one had the experience of working at G4. But I'll say it straight that everyone at G4TV that was there, everyone that worked on a TV show was by profession and by trade a professional writer in the comedic arts, or as a producer for television, right? And the reason that comes into play is because, again, as I mentioned, we didn't really have a lot of gaming content to actually produce. A lot of it was, look, here's a video game, create content around it, right? Or create content that you can integrate a video game as part of. And that's why when you look at a lot of old shows on X-Play and Attack of the Show, a lot of it was actually, yes, it was written for essentially teenage boys, but the people who were writing it were essentially, again, most of my colleagues at the time were probably like late 20s-ish, who were on the writer side, and most of us were like, yeah, like, look, I'm a comedy writer first that just happens to like video games, and so I'm going to kind of write, content that would be funny for, a teenage crowd, but put it in with a lot of pop culture references that, for a wider context, people could, get a good chuckle out of it. And the reason I say that was because like that's a big deal was because I remember even during my interview at G4TV when I was, getting my job, one of the things that I mentioned was like, look, I just thought it was just hilarious that you had this review on X-Play that just spoke about Sanford and Son, right? Like a 70s TV show, a black comedy from the 1970s, and it's just randomly referenced on this review on X-Play. And that's completely not the demo of people watching, but it was just so funny and so ridiculous, again, that yes, it was content. The channel was catered toward 13-year-olds, really, but people who were kind of like in their late teens or early 20s would actually kind of appreciate a lot of these kind of outside gaming / pop culture references, that it kind of made the appeal of X-Play, or an Attack of the Show, it brought in the appeal for people who like, look, I play video games, right? But I'm not like some hardcore nerd. I'm not like some, freak show that is like my life revolves around just video games. It kind of made it seem like, hey, you know what? This is actually kind of a, content that I could easily watch because it's not so just hardcore gaming, and it is actually something that is something I could just sit down, enjoy, and watch, have a good chuckle. Obviously it's cool to look at video games, but best of all, it's like the writing was really well done that had a, really good integration of like, layman speak, pop culture, and I would say, just a sense of, almost making fun, or, having, being able to be self-deprecating of exactly what the culture was at the time, right? A lot of, myself and the other fellow writers, yes, like I said, we loved video games. We absolutely loved video games, but like our profession by trade first was, look, were educated and trained in the TV and film industry. Okay, we were professional producers, professional writers, right? This is what we did for a living. Okay, we didn't weren't born into like, as you could say, the YouTube world or the Twitch world. And no disrespect to any of them, but there's a different, I guess you could say, skill set level and a different, again, no knock on YouTubers whatsoever. I'm just basically saying that the people brought in to create content for G4 at the time in the original incarnation of G4TV, they were brought in because of their experience in the TV and film business, right? And they had experience in terms of like writing for comedies that were, again, had nothing to do with video games. Their experience was like, look, I was a former writer for Friends. I was a former writer for, Mad Magazine or whatever. They had experience outside of gaming, and most of the content, if you actually kind of watch a lot of the content of G4TV from back in the day, yeah, it's about video games, but really, you know, if you pay attention to the writing, it was mostly written about, what was going on in the modern world, and we just had to kind of fit in video games as part of it, so we could kind of have, I don't want to say a broad appeal, but at least be able to, have the attention of like these teenage kids, but still be able to, you know, get the much older audience to better understand like what they're, you know, you know, like watching, and like, appeal to them in the sense that like, look, video games are not wholly part of your life. And we were willing to be self-deprecating in the sense that like, oh my gosh, it's the typical anime nerds. Oh yeah, by the way, you love video games, you must be, overweight and chubby, and you must be like, probably no girlfriends or whatever. Like we made fun of that like quite often, right? That was kind of like the shtick of G4TV, was to be self-deprecating to our own audience, but not insulting. Okay, there's a big difference. We were self-deprecating, but not insulting. Um, we we made it clear that, hey, guess what, guys? We're all nerds. We're all kind of a bunch of losers, and we were putting on this show that's kind of for losers, right? Um, but we love you because we're also losers too. And it's just one of those things, like, as I watched the new iteration of G4TV, they're very, you could say political. There's, a lot of the hosts have a very PC type, you know, style. And again, G4TV back in the day, un-PC, man. Like, that thing was nothing but, you know, sexist jokes. I would say in some sense, like, even, um, you know, by some degree, had a lot of jokes that would be very offensive, very borderline, right? Not even borderline, like clearly offensive in today's world. Um, but that was kind of how G4TV, was kind of built upon. It was like literally like, look, we know that people who are going to be watching this like video games. However, we are trying to like be cooler than that, right? So that way the older adults who look like, they got real lives now, and we want to make sure that what they're watching can appeal to them. So first and foremost, to summarize everything, the reason why really G4TV's content isn't, their new G4TV's content just isn't working, is because the content, the people unfortunately are creating the content in a very video game first approach. Whereas again, back in the day of G4TV, it was like, look, we're gonna write this from a pop culture approach first, and we're gonna somehow squeeze in video game content into that. In fact, if you pay attention to all the old X-Play reviews from back in the day, the way how we got the reviews was, no one on the writing team for X-Play or AOTS or any video game show, nobody like actually wrote the reviews. We didn't actually play the games and write the reviews. What we would do is we would send the game to, an outside, freelance writer or journalist, and their job was to actually play the game. So these were like actually professional video game writers or journalists. Their job was to play the game, give us kind of like the cliff notes of like, okay, this is why it's bad, this is why it sucks, here's kind of like the play mechanics to kind of be aware of. Here's our score, right? So no one on X-Play gave the scores. The scores were determined by some freelance writer that could have just been having an off day. Sorry to break everyone's hearts about, how the 5-star ratings were created. But essentially what would happen would be we would get like this kind of cliff note or like kind of baseline of like how the game's review should be, or what the score would be. And then the writing team, which again was primarily mostly, comedic writers, we would essentially take that review and try to, wrap around it basically a sketch or comedy that would just integrate the game in some context. So if you look at a lot of the G4 TV content right now, again, they're trying to go with like, hey, here's the game, and based on the game, we're gonna try to make something like some sketch about it whatsoever, or make it funny, right? But it's based on the game. It was the other way around during the original G4 TV. It was like, look, just tell us what this review is, but we're gonna wrap around it. Okay, we're gonna wrap around it like some random segment may not be even interconnected whatsoever, and we're just going to integrate this review as part of it. So that's what kind of gave G4 TV's content back in the day a little bit much more, you know, not cringy, as I like to say, compared to the current G4 TV to watch. Now, I, I'm not trying to knock anyone who is kind of working at G4 TV, because I understand and I know they're working very hard. In fact, some of my old colleagues from the original G4 TV are actually now working at the current G4 TV. But I think that is what was lost in this new transition, in the revival. To top it all off, um, I'll talk about the personalities here, and I know there's been a lot of controversy with some of the people they've mentioned in terms of some of the current G4 TV personalities, kind of have going on, unhinged, rants about their fan base and whatnot. Now, here's here's my only thing. Of all the G4 TV hosts, I'll be honest with you, I didn't really think any of them had the allure of the original host, right? Um, Here's why. With the exception of maybe Kevin Pereira, who, at the time when he came to G4 TV, he was a production assistant, and he slowly kind of rose up the ranks to basically be on air talent. With the exception of him, most of the talent that was brought into G4 TV, again, just like the writing team, none of them were really kind of gamers. They were like, look, I went to school, or I have been working in my life to be an on-air personality, first by trade, right? First by trade, an on-air personality. Doesn't make a difference if I'm going to be an actor, if I'm going to be a presenter, if I'm going to be kind of even, a broadcast journalist, whatever, or like a news anchor. By trade, they came in as and auditioned as on-air personalities as their professional backgrounds. It just happened that they just also, were geeks or loved video games back in, as a hobby. Perfect example of this, Olivia Munn. Okay, Olivia Munn, when she auditioned, yes, she had a strong understanding of nerd culture, but her MO was to be an on-air personality. Look, that's what she has, trained up until that point in her life. That's what she had practiced. That is what, she had been educated in. She had been educated to be an on-air personality. Didn't matter if it was like, look, presenting the news, presenting, you know, um, you know, male content, or presenting, or being an actress. Her job was like, look, I'm here because my skill set is to be on air, watchable, and you're going to like me, based upon my on air personality, right? And a lot of the hosts that they brought in my opinion, they were really just like, look, I'm known to be a gamer. I'm a gamer, and I talk about video games. My profession first by trade is I love video games, and I based my career around video games. And that may have turned into them being a host on, a YouTube channel, or being I'm trying to think of like some, or being a host for the world of video games. But the truth be told is that, like, look, the people who originally auditioned at G4, you know, that wasn't their thing. They were kind of people who were brought in specifically on air because we know people would watch them. You know, Olivia Munn, okay, when she did her audition, I'm gonna put it bluntly, she oddly enough was not, I would say, the, you know, didn't, in my opinion, she didn't really audition well. I thought she was great. I thought she was like really, a really nice person. Don't get me wrong, super nice, incredibly, poised and calm on camera. But compared to like the other, I guess, auditioners at the time, they kind of knew like, look, I'm auditioning for to talk about video games and blah blah blah, and really go out of control, wild and out. The reality is we knew with Olivia Munn, we knew that her style, her personality style, and to be also put it out there, her looks was what was going to attract that audience. Okay, we knew that people would want to watch her for her. Okay, they honestly were not trying to watch her to know about video games. No, it was based upon Olivia Munn. Same with the other host, okay? Like Adam Sessler, okay? He was I know he came from the world of finance before, but he wanted to become a journalist. So he was brought on air, at the time when it was extended play, because, like, look, this guy who, he happens to really love video games and has a passion for it, but at that point in his life, he was becoming trying to be an on-air journalist. And that was why, we decided, hey, let's, again, he was before my time, or before my time at G4 when it was still the early predecessor Tech TV, but he was brought in to be look, people are going to want to watch him because he can be a good shtick, a good on-air journalist with a shtick, right? The host that they have now on G4TV, unfortunately, and again, no knock on them, but it's just like when you're trying to compare the expectations of what people were hoping to get with the new G4TV versus what they previously got, they weren't getting people who were, in the sense, made for TV. Okay, these were not the TV personalities. These were not people whose profession and coming in was meant to first be like, look, I'm going to be a presenter for whether it be Wheel of Fortune or, as a news anchor or as a, host on Vice, for example, a reporter on Vice, right? These people were, kind of really first gamers first or game hobbyists first. Secondly, then that just led to a career in kind of being on-air personalities. So that's kind of a big difference. Again, like if you just see kind of the running narrative that I'm like kind of describing, mostly everything is like, look, the whole G4TV wasn't really based on video games as much as like people, realize. A lot of the staffing, a lot of the writing, a lot of the on-air personalities, look, they came from a different world and were being basically asked to say, hey, talk about video games, right? Unfortunately, it came at a time when the industry was, or, the genre or the art of video games was just not mainstream culture yet, okay? It was a popular hobby, but it just wasn't like as ubiquitous with being okay with, adulthood and adult life as it is now. Back then, video games were still seen as like at best, college frat boy, experience. Most video game, playing was not really kind of taken as seriously as it is now, right? It was pretty much like, look, this is a boy to college, frat life, right? Hate to say it, but that's what it was. That was the perception of video games back then. And, the content that was created to talk about on the original G4 TV was made for that demo, right? It was made to cover that demo of, and what people knew, how people, especially for gamers and gamers who were self-aware of how video games are viewed by, the greater public. In the current G4 TV, like I said, I don't feel with a lot of like their very PC type, nature of content and how the content is just very trying to be, unfortunately, trying to put video games in a much higher pedestal than it can still be taken even at this point in the industry. It just wasn't compelling, and to be blunt, it was boring and not as funny, right? It's people want to be entertained, and I looked at a number of the content, and it just really wasn't entertaining. Okay, and there's no excuse for saying budgets. Okay, I've read a lot of comments and watched a lot of YouTube videos about talking about G4TV and the comparisons of new versus old, and they're saying, well, the old G4 had better budgets. No, it didn't. It had terrible budgets, actually, for its time. And people don't realize G4TV had real shitty budgets, man. Like real terrible budgets, horrible budgets. Okay. G4, like, was pretty much, is the best way I can kind of put it, was low production value, low end production value. And that's, to me, another testament to the writing, because they worked with the limitations of like cheap productions to make it funny, right? Meaning that they used that to their advantage. We used the advantage of like having crap production to our advantage to make things look even worse, right? And laughable because it's so ghetto looking, right? You'll probably look at a lot of like old X-Play review clips, and you'll notice that they use a lot of like Microsoft, Paint like drawings. Why? Well, because that's the best of what we could afford for even graphics packages. Like literally, I remember working on a segment and I used Microsoft Paint, like literally Microsoft Paint, to draw like some like stupid stick figure, and that was what was like animated on screen, right? It was like, damn, like it's really shitty. It's really ghetto, man. But in a way, because it looks so ghetto, it was to our advantage and made it funny. We worked, we were creative with these budget limitations to make them, to make it work. And I look at kind of the new G4TV, and it's still pretty glossy. I'm sure their budgets aren't that big either, but unfortunately, it's too glossy. It's too glossy for what, for it, to be funny in a way. And it's not to say that, you can't have funny stuff where, the production value is more higher end, but there doesn't seem to have that creative feel to it that the old G4TV had, where, again, they worked the limitations to their advantages, right? It feels like here in the current G4TV, it feels like their limitations are exactly that, limitations, and we can only produce only, what's possible within those limitations, right? And again, comparing it to old G4TV was work with the limitations to your advantage, right? It wasn't a barrier. It was essentially like, a means to help, drive the narrative, so to speak, and, kind of create a sense of identity to like how the content was created. New G4TV, it's like, look, our budget limitations are exactly that, limitations, and we can't do better or higher than what we're able or capable of. So, short summary, running through all of these things that I kind of just mentioned, again, the staff that was essentially brought in was, not from video game elk, right? The on-air personalities that were brought in were, again, by profession, non-video game, aspiring actresses, actors, TV personalities, right? And last but not least, it's the way how they've been using their budget limitations. G4TV, the old school G4TV, that was the identity. The identity was kind of like, look, it's a ghetto channel, right? It's like channel 7,000 and whoever, could get it. Whereas like the new G4TV, it's more accessible by more people, right? And, YouTubers and Twitch, streamers, they've proven like, look, you don't need to have big budgets to create compelling content. And so it's kind of shocking that with the resources that the new G4 TV has, which under the umbrella of Comcast, you know, there isn't that sense of anything special, right? I feel bad trying to knock G4 TV because I really wanted it to be a success. I started my careers there. I met, a lot of my mentors there, and it's provided me, I'll never forget that year, some incredible experiences. My first time I've got to go to E3, which was always a dream to me, to be an exhibitor at E3, to, see, you know, exclusive footage, right? None of that really exists in in today's world anymore, right? There's no kind of special media outlet that has that pull that G4 TV kind of had. I don't say they really had strong pull, but they kind of had a little bit of weight in the gaming sphere back then because they were the only game in town, right? Now, unfortunately, you know, G4, the original incarnation of G4 TV it wasn't ahead of its time. It's just that the audience just didn't exist yet. Okay, a lot of people will say, well, no, gamers were always there. No, they weren't, man. They were not there when we were out. They did not exist, right? Uh, G4 TV's ratings back in the day, even at its peak in 2004, 2005, 2006, were still dismal, right? It was super low, and people will just not understand that the old school G4 TV was never a hit. It was a hit amongst the people who knew about it or went to like a GameStop and saw it, right? But G4 TV back in the day was never a hit. It was never a success. As hard as that is to say, it never pulled in strong viewership, right? Even like at its like best moments, which was E3 coverage, San Diego Comic-Con coverage, or the G4 TV award show, right, where we kind of gave these video game awards. None of them really had kind of groundbreaking numbers that made, at the time, Comcast, the parent company, that made them say, hey, this thing could be the next, our next Bravo, right? And that was kind of the big thing that we had at G4 was like, look, we need a standout show. We at the time, with Bravo, before Bravo kind of became like what it is now, where it's like nothing but like reality shows and see what happens, their slogan, Bravo didn't really have that. They had, they were kind of also kind of in limbo until they had Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. So that became kind of the thing at the old G4, was a lot of the analysts, the CEO, Charles Hishorn, and the producers, they said, like, look, we got to find a way to kind of have this breakout show. We need our Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. We need our equivalent of that for G4. We need something that was going to help us get out of, help us have broader appeal and reach audiences to go check us out. It never happened, unfortunately, at G4 TV. They had popular shows amongst, the niche, like X-Play, but they never had like a breakout show that kind of went beyond that gaming niche. And in the same way with the current, you know, the new iteration of G4 TV, they still don't have like a segment or kind of you could say a property that transcends beyond just really the video game niche, right? Like, they don't have something, let's say, like, Complex's The Hot Ones, right? Where it's a show about people eating, hot wings or whatever. And tons of people watch it who are not part of that complex pop culture scene, right? They're just random YouTube, viewers. But the appeal of that show has a greater appeal than compared to like most of that complex demo of, you know, early or late Gen Zers who are trying to be like, hey, cool, and we're living like that old past. No, most of the current G4 TV just doesn't have a breakout, unfortunately. And same thing like back in the day in 2005. We didn't have a breakout, and that led to our downfall. And unfortunately, that's if unless the um, new G4 TV can somehow find some strike gold and and try to have like a breakout hit online. It's not gonna happen, right? It's not gonna happen. So, do I think G4 TV can turn it around? Yeah, I definitely think so. I think, look, they have the infrastructure there, right? I think that was probably the hardest thing to get off the ground is if they were going to revive the G4 TV um, brand. They needed to have, just the infrastructure in place, like literally equipment, right? Uh, and that's a great thing. Now it's only just boils down to like, look, how can we make the content better? Now, they have to also be aware that a lot of the people who used to watch G4 TV back in the day, those were like 13, 14-year-old kids, right? Those kids are now like in their 30s, okay? So to watch toilet humor for them, like as they used to watch on the old G4, that's not going to cut it anymore, right? Like they won't be interested in that. And a lot of new kids, they have no idea what the hell G4 TV is. They weren't around 15 years ago, right? So really your main target demo is to say like, look, step one, can we first try to recapture those old viewers, right, who are now much older? And how can we get them to watch our YouTube channel? Well, in my opinion, do kind of what the original G4 TV did. They created content for teenagers, but it was savvy enough that it would appeal to an older demo who are in their late 20s. And that's basically what this current iteration of G4 TV has to do. They have to find a way to say, like, look, we're trying to rekindle that magic that the old audience used to watch, but they're much older now, and they're not going to watch this toilet humor nonsense. So write content, create content, and produce content that is going to be, yes, it will be talking about video games, but be mindful of the nostalgia and the expectations that the old that this new that this older audience will now have, and try to use some of that magic of broadening the appeal of what was done during the old G4, where we brought in the content. So yes, while it's still catered to kids, it was still pretty laughable for older adults. So with that said, I don't know where G4 TV goes from here. All I know is that a lot of the people who've been writing reviews on YouTube, they're all outsiders, man. Like, and no disrespect to them either, but unfortunately they didn't know the background of what really made G4 TV back in the day and how a lot of the content was created at the original G4. So I'm hoping the best of luck for the remaining staffers at G4. But here's to hoping they can help turn around, because it's a great legacy brand. It was a part of my life, and I want to still be out there. I want to be successful. I want to be able to tell people, hey, do you watch G4? Yeah, I was part of its original incarnation back in the day, right? I would love for G4 TV to be a success, and I just hope that they have some self-realization as to what their product currently is, and knowing like to say, hey, we gotta have to probably turn things around to appeal for an audience that, is not the original OG audience of G4 TV. Anyways, I'd love to know your thoughts. I know this was like a long ramble, but what do you think about G4 TV now? Both the old and the current, based upon my discussion about it. Anyways, this is Neon Polygons. Thanks again for watching, and catch you all again soon.